Welcome to another episode of Dialogues with me, Richard Reeves. My guest today is Carole Hooven, who is an evolutionary biologist who teaches at Harvard University, who has a new book out, which is called T, The Story of Testosterone, the hormone that dominates and divides us. It's a gripping read. It ranges from her work at the beginning of her studies with chimpanzees in Uganda through a real tour of the evolving science around the way in which testosterone androgenizes and alters us. And she's actually been interested in this question of what explains behavior, in particular men's behavior, for a very long time now, partly because of her own difficult experience. And that's where, as a high schooler, we actually start with that, and how she barely scraped through high school and then made her way through an interesting route to the jungles of Uganda and then the seminar rooms of Harvard. And she talks about how the debates over sex differences have now become really politicized, and how, in her view, that's leading to some bad science. And you will hear her arguing very strongly that even inconvenient truths are truths nonetheless. As you'll hear, that one of my takeaways from, I think, a very strong research showing that testosterone, hormones, biology does matter for our behavior, is that it makes culture matter more, not less, because culture is the way in which we channel and encourage our natures. And so the nature-nurture dichotomy is even less helpful than it might appear. And acknowledging that there are natural differences in this case between men and women does not mean that in any way that's destiny. It just means that we have to think hard about the interaction between culture and nature. So I think because of the nature of the conversation, it gets a little bit personal at times, but I think that's appropriate enough. And we end by talking about the need to not pathologize the male desire for sex. We both have sons, so we're able to talk about that too. So it's an interesting blend of a fascinating personal story and I think some really important intellectual work too. So I hope you enjoy it. Carole Hooven, welcome to Dialogues.
Hi, thank you for having me.
I'm excited for this conversation. You have a whole book out on T, on testosterone, and I want to talk about why testosterone is such a big feature of your research, why it matters, and then hopefully we can get into what to do about it, and what is this knowledge about the role of how does it help, I suppose, is where we're going to end. But I want to start at the beginning, which is where your journey. You brilliantly describe catching urine from chimps peeing out of trees in Uganda. Talk about how you ended up doing that job and how that led into this area of research.
Yeah, that's great. I'm going to go back to high school. Of course, I dream about going back to high school constantly and sitting in classes for which I am not prepared if there's an exam or something. That I have that dream, as many people do. And that actually happened to me repeatedly. I shouldn't say happened to me. That was my situation in high school. I actually didn't go to a lot of classes. And the reason I'm starting back at high school is because I teach students in college, and a lot of them have a lot of anxiety about how they're doing in my class, what if they got a B- or, heaven forbid, something in the C range, which of course rarely happens at Harvard. And they're nervous about if they're going to be able to get where they want to go. And I always like to just be honest about where I came from. I was not at the top of my class in high school by a long shot. In fact, I skipped so many classes that I was allowed to walk in the graduation ceremony, but I did not have a diploma in the folder. And I was really just had a lot of energy. I was not focused or disciplined, was not interested in school, was not interested in science. I didn't have a lot of parental oversight. And that I think that period in my life, given that I was out at night, sometimes all night, drinking, doing various drugs, totally naive about male behavior. And that was a bad situation for me to be in. And nobody ever counseled me about how to conduct myself or what to expect. And, so my book isn't about that specifically, but it is about not expecting the opposite sex to be like you necessarily, that there are differences, they are important, they are impactful. And yes, that's just where I came from, sort of intellectually and emotionally. And I didn't kind of connect the dots about my obsession, my later obsession with testosterone. As you know, you read the book, I connected the dots at the end, literally when I got to writing the last chapter. And I said in the book, I'm not going to, give it away, but I said, here I am. It's sort of embarrassing that I'm just connecting the dots.
I think all scholarship is autobiographical to some extent or the other. I think it's just a question of when you realize that and what you do with that knowledge. But given the knowledge you now have, what would you advise your younger self? It's obviously an emotional subject for you.
Yeah, because I think not really when you're young and vulnerable and you don't understand how the world works, obviously you can be really hurt in a lot of different ways. And that's the thing that I think good parenting at that stage would have done for me. And, I would never want to convey the idea that women or even young women are simply victims or that they're ever to blame, for what happens to them in terms of sexual assault or just getting into situations that make it more likely that something like that is going to happen. And I was in those situations. So I wish that someone had taught me how to take care of myself and make better choices, because I wasn't in a position to change male behavior at that time in my life. Maybe I can have some influence now. So it wasn't about fighting for my rights to do what I wanted or changing male behavior and focusing on changing male behavior. At that point, it's really about me making choices that would have protected me and understanding something about male nature that was different from my own. Yeah, I guess that's what I wish for. And if
you would have protected yourself better. Well, one of the things you also say in the book is there are these differences between men and women and how much they become tearful. And you say yourself that you can become tearful. I didn't expect to do that to you within the first 5 minutes.
Well, I'm surprised I didn't do it in our talk, talk that we were having before.
In the green room. But thank you for sharing that. That's obviously important. And I think it speaks to one of the themes we're going to get to, which is to find this middle ground between, and I guess this, your own anthropological work in Uganda and elsewhere helped you with this, but to recognize the reality of sex differences and therefore the potential different kinds of threat that are posed without in any way explaining it or saying that it's okay. So there's this weird middle ground, because on one hand, you could be outraged that you should even have to think like that. There is a strand of thought now, which is, it is simply outrageous that women have to think about the threat of men, right? They shouldn't have to, and that's just patriarchy. And there's another view, which is, it's all your fault. If you behave that way, you got what was coming to you, right? To put it very crudely. But there's this middle ground, it seems to me, you're trying to occupy, which is to have an awareness of those differences without in any way forgiving them.
Yes. So what I try to do in the book is to explain the relevant facts and the relevant science, and not just to focus on male aggression, but all aspects of sex differences, where they come from, and the positive and negative aspects of some of, the extremes of male behavior, not just sort of the middle ground where there's a huge amount of overlap between men and women, but some of these extremes, because that's where the urgency really lies in understanding ourselves. So I am a passionate proponent of understanding reality and sharing openly and honestly what we understand and what we've, in my case, what we've discovered through the scientific method, and what the best science, the science that's most robust and well replicated, what does that tell us about who we are? Yes, and without shame or judgment of any kind, just purely for understanding. That I see that as my job. I can use that information for my own decisions in my own life. And I have, I describe in the book how incredibly empowering I have found that information and understanding the facts about evolution and why we have these different hormones and different hormone levels and how they've shaped our bodies and behavior over our lives. And for me, I want to share that with, as many people as possible, because it is empowering, and understanding ourselves and the people around us and our cultures and, how the world works in general.
Yeah, you have this lovely point somewhere where you say, just beware of findings that go strongly against your intuitions. I would say the same is true the other way around. I think one of the things I very often say to my fellow social scientists is, unless a lot of your findings are making you uncomfortable, then you're probably not doing very good work.
Right.
That's right. You don't like it. It's inconvenient.
Yeah. Otherwise, you're suffering from confirmation bias. Right.
So everything I think you've said about that is right. But so we've had a glimpse into the high school you. We now know that you're a highly successful professor at Harvard.
I think the title is important. So I don't have a research lab, and my students call me professor, but I'm actually a permanent lecturer. So that's important because there is a status hierarchy, and the tenured professors who are in my department happen to be mostly male, who have been overall wonderful to me and supported my efforts hugely in making this book happen, for one thing. They are tenured professors with active research labs. I've been focusing on teaching and running the undergraduate concentration and advising the undergrads. So my expertise in my area is really from the research that I do for my teaching, which all concerns the relationship between hormones and behavior.
And you teach a very popular class on this whole issue of sex differences, which you talk about. And it seems like you struggled through high school, then alighted on this issue, decided you really wanted to understand anthropology, and you wanted to understand men. I think you say you were just driven by a desire to understand men and what drives behavior. And so you were battering at the door of a colleague. This is Robert Wrangham. Did I get his first name
Richard
right?
Wrangham. Well, there was 10 years between college and deciding that I wanted to go to graduate school.
And that
was also a period of, I was working for a financial software company. I just was really trying to get my footing in the world and do some growing up, and a lot of traveling, a lot of reading, and taking a lot of different classes finally in genetics and molecular biology. And I really discovered I had a passion there. But it was really the traveling and, I would say, reading, like, Richard Dawkins, that helped me to focus my intellectual interests. It was just a matter of sort of personally gaining the experience and confidence that I needed to go to graduate school. So yes, I quit my job and applied to Harvard, to the graduate program, to work with Richard Wrangham, who had written a book called Demonic Males,
yes,
in which he tried to understand the evolutionary origins of human aggression, particularly in males, by studying non-human primates, particularly chimpanzees, at his field site in Uganda. And that's something that really inspired me. I thought, this is exactly what I want to do. Not because I was obsessed with aggression per se, but I thought, if I want to understand human behavior, because at that point I was just really interested in the evolutionary origins of human behavior. And then I applied, I got rejected, and I had people, in hindsight, it was really because I had just a couple people who believed in me and said, you can do this, don't give up, keep at it. And when I had first applied and got rejected, I went back up to Harvard and met with as many people as I could. And then Richard Wrangham finally, after I pestered him enough, offered me a job in Uganda to manage his research site for a year and learn to do some field research, which you really need. You need to get some of that experience in order to get into a graduate program like that. So I felt like the luckiest person on earth, and I jumped at the opportunity. It so happened that it was an extremely violent time in the region in western Uganda on the Congolese border. The Rwandan genocide, was relatively recent at this time. This was in the late 90s. It was a lot of unrest and very serious, bloody violence in the region. So people were concerned about that. But that was sort of the environment that I went into. And then, of course, living in the jungle, basically, and being with the chimps every day, there's a lot of aggression there, too. But, of course, it's primarily among the males. And I actually, after 8 months spending every day with the chimps, I personally never saw any physical aggression among the females, where I would see it many, many times a day among the males. And that doesn't mean that there aren't females who are extremely aggressive, even murderously so, and that's definitely happens in chimps. And that's just an illustration of the fact that there is an overlap in these kinds of behaviors. There's always an overlap between males and females. It's not the case that X behavior is confined to males and Y behavior is confined to females, unless you're talking about lactation or gestation or something, related to that. But yeah, so I got to personally witness these extreme differences in basically aggression and nurturing, which I was really struck by. And it was at that point that I became obsessed with testosterone with evolution and testosterone, because those are the forces that, for me, were had the most potent explanatory power in trying to make sense of sex differences in animals and humans. Humans are primates. We are apes. We just have this incredibly bizarre culture that can amplify or sort of tamp down some of those differences in really interesting ways.
Yeah, so there's a cultural, the interaction between nature and culture is very much more complex in humans and obviously much stronger for reasons that you've just identified. But I think it's worth making this point at the outset so that you don't have to keep making it, which is many of the things you're talking about have overlapping distributions. And,
that's right.
And people mistake.
Just on average.
Dear listener, presume that we're saying that, presume the distributions overlap. In my own work, I've just been looking at, for example, earnings, right? So we know there's a gender pay gap, but it's also true that 40% of women earn more than the median man now. So there's it's a great example of an overlapping distribution, and where
so it's the difference of the average versus the median.
Yeah. Well, just that both distributions have shifted to the right, but there's just like the increase in number of women higher up is just massive. And so if you just look at the gap between the medians, you see this. What you don't notice is all the women going past the male median. So it's just it's like height or anything else. There's overlapping distribution. Although, interestingly, one of the most striking charts in your book is of testosterone, where there is no overlap between the distributions at all. I mean, it's not only is it bimodal, but you say something like there's a vast plane,
wide and complete separation, and that's some people are trying to push back against that. Because it depends on what kind of studies you're looking at, what kind of methods they used. But even if you look at the studies that used less than the most rigorous methods and accurate methods to measure testosterone levels, even those studies, if there is any overlap, it's absolutely minuscule, and it's usually there's a good explanation for the cases in which, like, someone who identifies as a female might have male typical levels of testosterone, and that may be because she, in fact, has internal testicles and has XY sex chromosomes. So the studies that use the most rigorous methods and that verify health and sex, those are the studies that show wide and complete separation. In cases if you have a tumor or something, if you're a woman that secretes high levels of androgens, then it's possible to be in the male range. Or if a male is taking medication for prostate cancer, then his testosterone levels might be in the female range. So there are cases where there will be overlap. But if you do a study that looks at natural, healthy variation, then you're going to see, yes, very wide and complete separation. And there just should be no argument there. And it's too bad that I feel like we're kind of wasting time arguing about that point. That's something that should just be acknowledged.
Yes, it certainly seems convincing to me, at least. And I think obviously we'll get to this, but the political agendas of various people come into play there. And also you make the strong point that some people will say that the within male distribution of testosterone doesn't explain, say, athletic outcomes. So so that's being overplayed in the difference between men and women in sports, for example. But you make the point very clearly that just because within among male competitors, it's not the only thing that matters. Of course, it isn't. It still means
yes. I don't know if you want to talk about that now or later, because if you wanted to talk about it now, I would probably go off on some rant.
Well, let's see if we have time for it to come. It's just one. It's honestly, I think the whole issue of sports in particular is just one of those things that's just a microscopic percentage of people. Of course, it's an issue, but then it gets blown out of all proportion in the culture wars. Essentially, it's just one of those things where it's just you feel like a bit of common sense and trust would just deal with most of this, but it's become. It's become a fetish, I think, kind of on both sides. So let's not go there now. Let's see how we do. Let's go back. So your basic argument is, I'm going to quote directly from the book here, that testosterone plays a central role in human sex differences and not just in physical traits. So hard to get people to disagree with the physical traits bit, and pretty convincing.
Although there are some who do. Okay,
well, let's not even go to them. Let's just deal with the people and you do actually engage directly with a number of the people on the other side of this debate, which is you're making a strong, convincing argument to moment that testosterone matters to our psychology, etc. And I think the first thing to do is just deal. I think you do directly deal with the problems here, just politically, small p. You describe it as a morally suspect view to suggest there could be biological bases for sex differences. I remember when the financial crash happened, people said, well, that was just testosterone, etc. Yeah. I was just reading Frank Fukuyama's article on what if the world was run by women. You've been accused of neurosexism. And I'd love you to explain a little bit about why you think that is, right? So your good faith critics, the sensible ones, what do you think is the basis for this discomfort with your position? Let's give them the best possible argument, rather, because there's a lot of people on the other side.
This is very, very good practice. So the best possible argument. I think the best place to start is that what I share with my critics is a deep concern for reducing human suffering. And we share the goals of wanting to overall reduce suffering, reduce physical violence, reduce sexual violence, increase gender or sex equality, opportunities for women in particular, to have a safer and more just world that also includes equal rights for people with all kinds of differences, particularly of gender expression. That's incredibly important to me. I'm very, very passionate about that. And part of the reason is because in teaching this material, I have formed relationships with many students over the years, and pretty strong not intimate physically, but kind of intimate emotionally, relationships with students who are suffering because they are different in those ways. And they take my class because they want to understand more about what's going on in their bodies and brains. So I am very passionate about supporting people who are different and trying to ensure that they have the rights that they deserve, equal rights. So we share the same goals. Where we differ is how to achieve those goals. So my broad view, again, is that social progress depends on scientific progress. And I just fail to see how obscuring scientific facts or consistently downplaying biological explanations in favor of cultural explanations for behavior, I fail to see how that promotes the agendas that I have just described. If the idea is to argue that men and women aren't really that different biologically, and if they're not that different biologically, and even if sex itself is not so dependent on biology, but is more dependent on identity, then that means that it's about culture or about our psychology, and that means that somehow magically everybody should have equal rights. So getting from that argument to that will promote equal rights more effectively than the truth, which I see as, of course, there's just an interaction of genes and environment that produces all behavior, and we should do everything we can to understand exactly how that works. I think the fear is that biological explanations for behavior or for, say, the patriarchy. I think the perception is that, well, if testosterone promotes status-seeking behavior and competitive behavior and aggression, then that means somehow that it validates those behaviors. That it validates those behaviors socially, that people will think they're entitled to those behaviors, that they're justified because they're natural, which is just plain incorrect.
Yeah,
and if you understand the science, you can understand why. Yes, but you have to learn the science and to understand why that conclusion is incorrect. And the second fear is that we think that not only might that those kinds of explanations validate undesirable behaviors or the status quo that we want to change, but people perceive biology as being immutable, or the consequence, anything that is genetic means we're just stuck with it and there's nothing you can do about it. But that is just silly, because we know that just take little kids, take a 5-year-old. Some people will raise their 5-year-old so that it's permissible for them to run screaming around a restaurant, right? So we know that the predisposition of the 5-year-old to do that is higher than it is in you and me because we're adults, right? And that has biological underpinnings. That has developmental biological underpinnings that have to do with the development of the brain, right?
Yeah,
but
those people should not be allowed to have children, by the way. But anyway,
right? Okay, I agree. But the point is that has to do with genes and biology. That little kids, the threshold for them to express that behavior is much lower, right? They're much more inclined to do that. However, the rules in the restaurant, the standards of the parents, the values of the local culture, the country that they live in, the religion that they are, what they had for breakfast, all of those things are going to have a massive impact on whether the kid runs and screams in the restaurant, right?
Yeah.
So everybody can see with their own two eyes that, okay, like in Singapore, the rates of male physical aggression are extremely low, and in especially sexual assault. In India, rates are much, much higher. But everywhere, males have a higher predisposition for physical aggression and sexual assault, by far. I mean, that's just a completely consistent pattern, and it's consistent with non-human animals. And we know that testosterone has that influence. But we see that culture can have a massive impact on the expression of that behavior and the modulation of, it's not the human nature that's the problem, it's the behavior and its consequences that we need to be paying attention to. Of course, we want to understand human nature so that we can best learn how to modify the way that it expresses itself in a given environment. And I just can't state that strongly enough. So if we constantly downplay and say, no, we're all the same, it's all culture is entirely to blame, then we might think, we fixed the problem now because we're addressing culture and that's all we need to do.
Yeah.
Well, no. And I'm just going to say one more thing. So I say, I talk in the book about my depression or type 2 diabetes. What I do, what I eat, how much I exercise has a huge effect on whether I feel those symptoms. I know it's genetic. I have it on one side of my family. I can't ever let up. I can't ever assume I've made the changes I need to make. Now I'm fine. I have done that before, and it was a disaster. I have thought I'm cured, and I didn't. You have the same thing?
Well, that bit really
or something similar
spoke to me. Yes, because similarly, vulnerability to depression, and I learned the hard way too that there are things I can do in the way that I conduct myself in my life to help kind of contain that. And when I don't do those things, then I get into trouble again. And so it's a great example of how the knowledge of nature can influence, in this case, it's a microculture. It's, I'm fortunate within my family circumstances and so on, but also like you, like exercise and so on. It's like I remember once I was actually running out somewhere in the southern US states, and this guy went past me in a truck and I'm running along a road. He's like, son, what are you running from? And I said, my depression.
Yeah.
And then he drove off. But so I think it's a great example. But it's interesting because what that means, of course, is that people like you who take natural differences seriously actually are therefore take culture in some ways even more seriously, because the role of culture in responding to, channeling, modifying, tempering, encouraging certain aspects of nature is even more important. If you think that there are these natural differences, it doesn't make culture unimportant. Paradoxically, it makes it even more important because...
That is such an interesting insight. And I think you're right. And I think it's a nuanced point that takes a little work to really appreciate. But I think you're right.
And it's lost by the nature kind of nurture thing. And this point about difference too, I love your point about difference, because there's one view, which is to get to equality, you have to sandblast away all differences, right? We're all basically the same, tabula rasa, because otherwise, different from what? What does it mean to be different? And it means different in some way to, quote, the norm. Who's to say what's normal? It comes back to this point about a distribution. It's always struck me that you can imagine something along a spectrum, like maybe gender, and say, there's a spectrum. There are people in the middle, right? There are not people that come to the end, but most people are clustered towards the end.
Sorry,
right?
When you say gender, what do you mean?
I mean in terms of like male, female. So you've got these bimodal distributions around testosterone, but you do have people who are intersex, which you talk about, for example. You talk about some people who are trans and so on. So in other words, it gets messy. Let's say it can get a little bit messy in the middle, but that doesn't mean that most people aren't clustered by and large towards one end of it.
But are you talking about gender expression? Because sex, of course, is binary. I know that's like not fashionable to say right now.
Well, no, you said
but there are males and there are females, and there are sperm and there are eggs. There's no intermediate gametes, and there are people who have conditions where their hormone levels or their genitalia or their chromosomes even might not match their gamete design plan, which is really what defines sex. But obviously that doesn't mean that sex is on a spectrum. So I just want to... Sure. I think that you're on the same page with me, and you were just talking about something a little bit different.
I wasn't being clear enough. But there's a good example of this, actually, which sharpens the point is, and I can't remember the name of the group now, but they're the ones who, I think they're in South America somewhere, who grow up as girls but then become boys in adolescence.
5-alpha reductase deficiency syndrome.
Yeah, so talk a little bit about what that is and what that tells us about how hormones affect our development and why, and how they're still binary, right? They're still one, or because they're born as one but then become another.
Yeah, so I will talk about I'm going to call it, the acronym is DSD, and it used to stand for disorder of sexual development, and now people say difference of sexual development, which I like. I like to reserve disorder for when there's a health problem that needs to be addressed. So these are interesting cases, and they usually I'm just going to start in utero and just explain briefly that in order for typical male development to take place in utero, to develop when I say internal and external genitalia, what I mean basically is, say, penis and a scrotum, and then the associated internal, say, plumbing, like the vas deferens, which is the equivalent, basically, of the fallopian tubes and other related structures. In order for those things to develop in the male, there has to be, first of all, testes present in general, that produce male typical levels of testosterone, which are very, very high. Female fetuses are exposed to almost no testosterone, very, very low levels typically. So testosterone can work as testosterone to do its job, but when it masculinizes something called the genital tubercle, which looks more like, it begins looking more like a clitoris, but it's actually the action of a derivative of testosterone called DHT that causes that to develop ultimately in the develop into a penis. And if there is even if there's testosterone, if there's no DHT action, then the tubercle will stay small, and a vagina, something that looks like a vagina that does not connect to a uterus, will develop. Right. And so this person would be born with genitalia that look female. So these people will be, if they're born in a place without sort of modern medical care, they would be likely to be sexed and raised as females. It's exceedingly rare, although it does occur, and they might be raised as girls. However, what's interesting is that in utero, testosterone acts, and I'm just going to use the word testosterone to mean testosterone or DHT. It acts on the androgen receptor. It has to interact with the androgen receptor to masculinize the reproductive structures, but at the same during gestation, it also acts to masculinize the development of the brain in ways that promote male reproductive behavior, like higher rates of rough and tumble play and physical aggression and status, attention to signals of status, and ultimately higher libido and, those associated kinds of characteristics. So what you see in these, they're actually little boys. They're male, right? These people with 5-alpha reductase deficiency. So, but they, in the cultures that we find them, a lot of time these cultures are have strict gender norms for each sex. So girls are supposed to, wear dresses and stay home and help their mothers, and boys are given much more latitude to go outside and play. Yeah. Yes, much more traditional. And so it's just a great opportunity to evaluate the role of testosterone in shaping, I'm just going to say, gendered behavior. Because typically these individuals, even if they are raised as girls, show much more male-typical behavior than a typical girl. Their behavior is masculinized. They're much more likely to act like a typical boy. Culturally, they may not be allowed to, but they certainly, when they hit puberty, many of them end up transitioning to live as a man. And it apparently is not just because at that stage they do go through a fairly typical male puberty, and they get increased body size, increased muscle mass, lower body fat, and they start growing a penis, albeit a smaller than normal penis, and their testicles might descend at that point. They may or may not descend. But a lot of them report, and their families report, that these, as kids, they were not typical girls. They were much more likely to show higher rates of like rough and tumble play, wanting to play physically with other kids and wanting to play with the boys instead of the girls. Sorry, that was a super long answer.
I think it covered a lot of ground, because you talked about the effect of androgens as well. And I learned from your book that androgen, in its original Greek terminology, means making men. And
man generating.
Yeah, so you get a default female embryo, but then we become male. But it also, I think that's the reason that's such a good example is because nobody knew. And so it was genuinely people were blind to the fact that this syndrome, this difference was going to appear. And so it's just a good test case of the extent to which, if you're treated one way, it makes you that way, as opposed to how your body's telling you. The difference between the signals from inside and the signals from outside, if you like. And that's a good it's a real world example. And you draw on lots of others, like people who've transitioned, people who have other kinds of differences, etc. People who, you make great use, I think, of people who have transitioned and taken huge testosterone shots as well. I know you spoke to Andrew Sullivan about this as well. In fact, you quote Andrew at some length about the differences between gay men and lesbian women, particularly around sex drive.
Sexual.
Yeah.
So sexual culture, sexual behavior,
Yeah, there's this great, I think I got this from Melvin Connor's book, Women After All, where he talks about driven sexuality. I think that's a really nice way to describe it, is that there's a sort of drivenness about it, a sort of intentional, it's on your mind a lot, you feel different.
Sort of goal-oriented.
Yeah, it's like
object, and potentially object-oriented and goal-oriented in a way it isn't typically for women.
Exactly, that's the end. I mean, there's this great, I think it's in Friends, I can't remember which comedy series it's in, but where one of the guys says to the women, it's just so complicated, like there's all these things you want, and it's difficult to know what you really want. And the woman says to him, well, it's better than just having like one thing that you want. All you guys ever want is one thing. And he says, well, at least we have the decency to let you know what it is. And there is a sort of clarity around that. And I want to talk a bit about that. But before just give me your quick take on where you place the most weight in terms of the evidence for the importance of testosterone from all the sources you draw on, because you draw on lots of different animals. You watch the red deer in Scotland. We have songbirds, obviously rats that we can put things in and out of and so on. We've also got the evidence from people with a difference in something like the case we just talked about. We've also got people who are transitioning. We can also take blood samples of men in different circumstances and test it. There's obviously, so there's different kinds of evidence that all point, I think, to the same direction. Which of those kinds of evidence do you find most compelling in the end? Like, if you could select one evidence base, where do you think you'd go?
Well, that's such a hard question. Can you give me a particular aspect of behavior that I can kind of focus on? Because it is, for me, really understanding the confluence of the evidence. Like, where does that
that's a good
all
question. That's fair. Well, let's take
point.
aggression. Let's say a greater propensity to aggression among men. If you're looking to show that that's true as a result of nature and in particular testosterone, where's your first go-to?
Yeah, it is looking at using a comparative perspective to look at the reproductive strategies that are that each sex tends to use, and across, you could look at, even if you look at mammals, you can look at other taxa, because it's common. I talk about birds, I talk about lizards, like you said, I talk about
it's like a zoo,
mammals. But what the common theme is that in most cases, males can, relative to females, increase their fitness, their reproductive success, by competing with other males for mating opportunities. And males, it's very unusual for males to invest in their offspring, as we see in humans. And that's the case in only about 5% of mammals. So we have to take that into consideration as a really important part of human behavior and culture. That plays a big role. But so that our sex differences in aggression aren't as large as we see in other species. And our males are nowhere near as physically aggressive as they are in many other species. So for me, it's that evolutionary comparative perspective and the knowledge in all of these other species about how testosterone tends to increase aggression, and in males specifically. It's not that females aren't aggressive in reproductive context, but it tends to be in regards to their offspring, that they would be physically aggressive in protecting their offspring or their own lives, because that's what benefits them reproductively. Males tend to benefit reproductively by competing with other males for status, for resources that they could use to attain additional mates. So that's what I see as the parsimonious explanation, the explanation that sort of unites the evidence in the clearest and simplest way. And depending on the trait, it may be helpful. I think it's also then, of course, crucial to look at the evidence in humans, and we can't do the kinds of experiments we do in non-human animals. So that's where we look at this natural variation in hormone levels and how it is related to masculinization of behavior. And I find that very powerful too. But I would say my dominant perspective is really that evolutionary comparative perspective.
Yes, and that gives you the framework within which to argue about it. I mean, Margaret Mead famously said that we shouldn't let women fight because women fight to protect their young, and when they do so, they'll fight to the death. So you don't want to trigger that kind of aggression. Her view was that male aggression was more containable than female, easier to trigger, but easier also to recede. Whereas female aggression was provoked by a desire to protect their young, and that was such a strong evolutionary. So she said, don't let women on the battlefield. So it was an interesting kind of way around to talk about it. This issue of aggression is obviously a strong theme, and I want to say what I think you're arguing and what I've read elsewhere, and see if this is right. So you've made the point that men explain like 95% of the murders. There is a clear difference. You have to be crazy not to see that, but also a huge drop over the last century or so, massive decrease and significant variation, as you just said, between places. So it tells us that culture is a huge factor. And I think so. It's the propensity for aggression, but there's also self-control. There are cultural norms. There's a complex set of things that go into our behavior. And my sense coming away from this was that men can be more aggressive. but they're not necessarily more aggressive on a day-to-day basis. And so if a threat appears or something, is that a fair summary of it? That there's and our testosterone spikes in those situations. So, but that there isn't a sort of day-to-day level. So I'm not necessarily more aggressive than my wife every day, right? But if someone ran up.
Oh, I'm definitely more aggressive than my husband every day.
Well, you said that they overlap.
I mean, yeah. So, I think it's important to ensure that we're talking about physical aggression, because we know that females can be extremely aggressive, but it tends to be in a way that doesn't put themselves at physical harm. And we see females really hurting other females, especially among young women and social media, and that there can be some very, very aggressive, cruel, competitive behavior. So what we're talking about is mostly physical aggression and a certain type of status competition with a certain style that we don't see in women, who are also status conscious and compete for status, but tend to do it in less direct confrontational ways. So just to throw that out there.
Yeah, I think that's right. Let's talk a bit more about sex drive and this driven sexuality point. You actually mentioned the famous Jeffrey Toobin Zoom.
Well, I threw that in at the last minute because I was finishing up the book when people.
I mean, sad for him, but a gift to many non.
I know I shouldn't laugh.
To many non-fiction
it is sad
writers.
For him.
But funny. But what's interesting is that we're talking about that the difference between my male friends and my female friends in that. So the reaction from women was, I can't believe he would do that, during a working day, be masturbating during the day. And the reaction from the men was, I can't believe he didn't figure out how to turn his camera off.
Oh, right. No, that was my reaction, was what an idiot. Why didn't he turn his camera? Of course he's going to do that during the day.
Yeah, well, you study this for a living. But I think for a lot of women, there's just this idea that on a sort of 15-minute break, on a Zoom call, that would be a great opportunity to masturbate. That wasn't just
right.
A lot of women didn't see that as just an obvious thing, whereas men were like,
right. Well, women don't even understand that their husbands are probably watching porn. They just think it's not their husband. Yeah, it is.
Yeah, well, if he has an internet connection, it's also said, like, any man who says he hasn't struggled with internet porn addiction is either a liar or has a terrible internet connection. But there is this sort of and there's great evidence again from the field in terms of this difference. And I think again, anyone with any common sense and human culture is based around this difference. What does that mean, do you think, in terms of how we should think about our relationships, how we think about culture? For example, I had your colleague Joe Henrik on and talking about how marriage, but I think more specific, fathering lowers testosterone.
Yes,
right?
Yeah.
And so monogamous marriage, like not so much in polygamous because you're still in the game and going out and getting more. And so what should our knowledge about the greater driven sexuality of boys and men do in terms of how we think about education, how we think about family, how we think about marriage? Is it a problem? How does this knowledge help me? I've got three sons. I'm a man. How does it help us today?
How old are your sons?
They're grown. They're early 20s and late teens. So we've been through puberty. With them. But
okay. So you brought up so much, and I want to make sure. I don't know how much more time we have, but I want to make sure that we get to a couple of points, a few different points that you raised. One is the monogamy and having kids thing. I want to make sure we talk about that. But before that, you talked about just how does this affect our relationships, and through writing this book and talking to a lot of different people, especially men, and having very open conversations with my husband and the transgender people I interviewed who changed their testosterone levels and experienced the changes that you would expect from going to female levels to male levels of testosterone and the effects that had on their sexual nature, their sexual desires, sex drive, and then going in the opposite direction, had the exact opposite effect, reducing the sort of urgency of the sexual need. But one thing that has been really interesting for me is to conceive as a woman of the try to understand the struggles that men face and feel, I think, ashamed about, and sometimes rightly so, because when they perceive women sometimes, or whatever the sex is that they're attracted to, because this also happens in among gay men where there's a view of the object of your sexual desire as somewhat of an object, right? So this is more of a masculine, male tendency than it is among females. And so females are on the receiving end of that and hate it. A lot of the time, they feel objectified, right? Mm-hmm. And rightly so, because they are, in fact, being objectified to some extent. And that is, I want to understand that because I don't think that urge is something to be shamed or judged. I think it's the actions that we need to evaluate and respond to, but we're never going to be able to help men navigate that tension that many good guys feel. I feel very passionate about this. I'm getting emotional again. Between their urges, which are different from ours on average, and they feel like, oh my God, I really am so sort of urgently attracted to this person. I want her body in a way, and I have this strong pull. I don't know how to talk to her. I don't even know how to consider her as a full human being and interact with her. So there's teaching that needs to be done. And it is not happening because there's so much shame. And I'm not saying that that's not understandable because it is hard to be on the receiving end of that. Women want to be taken seriously for who they are and they want to be treated as a whole human being. But I do now see that, oh my God, there is something that men are going through that women do not understand, have no sympathy or compassion for, which, again, understandable. But it doesn't mean that the people who feel this are bad. It's not bad. It's real. It's natural. It's something we have to understand and work with. And if we shut down the discussion, if we shut down the science, if we shame everybody for their natures, we are never going to make progress in helping men navigate what it is they want and how they get it and how they treat women. Gay men have sort of worked this out to some extent because they agree. They have a shared understanding of what they want. They don't necessarily feel, in some circumstances they might, but they don't take that desire as an insult. And women do, because they don't feel it back and they don't get it, and they're angry. And I get that.
So I'm very glad you said all of that, and I think that we'll take that clip and send it to everybody that's raising sons in 21st century, because I strongly agree with you. The difference, of course, is that when it's male desire for women, it brings in the gender imbalance, gender equality, feminism question. But I, like you, and having raised 3 boys and being a boy and being a man, I think it's incredibly important that we don't toxify male desire, including for women, because otherwise what I sort of see happening is that same-sex desire is applauded because great, you can be who you want to be. So our gay friends are like, great, have at it, fantastic. Similarly with women, if you want to be great, terrific. And actually, desire of women for men is celebrated too, right? So it's like if a woman wants to, be sexy and she wants to attract men and she's intimate, great. So it's like,
and she's allowed to objectify men because they will accept. I mean, they might tend to accept it in a way. They won't take it.
Yeah, and it's back to. I mean, it's unfortunately all my references seem to be dated sitcoms, but I'm sure it was Seinfeld who said women need a reason. women need a reason to have sex. Men just need a place. Right. But it's a real truth, and actually, we don't want to end up with a situation where strong desire for a woman, strong sexual desire for a woman, is bad. What the question, right? That it's not only good; it's natural. In fact, many doctors use it as a sign of health that you get an erection in the morning, for example, right? And actually, there's good evolutionary reasons why men do need to be ready to go, because you don't know how much opportunity you're going to get, right? So it makes perfect evolutionary sense. And I'm not going to I didn't make my sons feel bad about that. The question is, what do you then do about it? And you're right. You don't shame it. You structure it. I had this great quote from
you educate and you structure.
And you learn about
that what you're feeling isn't the same as what the woman is feeling. Don't expect it to be the same. That's where a lot of
which is why you develop these rituals and courtship and so on, which is to sort of somehow these very elaborate social structures, which actually somehow magically make it work despite these differences. That the headmaster of Stowe School, a big private school in the UK, was asked what he was trying to do. This is a boys' school, and he said, "I'm trying to produce men who will be acceptable at a dance and invaluable in a shipwreck.
Yeah.
That's just
gosh.
pretty good, I think, because you've got acceptable dance, which is, look, I know how to behave, I know how to contain myself, I know how to restrain, I know how to communicate desire without that being creepy, etc. And it's okay to be desire, it's okay to pursue as long as it's within certain. But at the same time, the ship's going down. You're going to need me to get the life rafts off and so on. And I think. I keep coming back to that phrase. I might even use it in my own work. I was like, that was from the 19th century, whatever that was. It's like, that's pretty good, actually, acceptable at a dance. And I do think there's a problem with this toxification. In fact, there's some Pew research I was looking at recently, which really stopped me in my tracks, which shows that masculine as a trait is now considered by most people not only to be negative applied to women, but negative as applied to men. So to be masculine. So I guess that leads me to the next question, which is, an inevitable consequence of your view, which I think is we are different. There's no inequality inherent in that. We can be equal as well as different. What are the good things about testosterone fueled behavior? What is it that the masculinization that results from testosterone? What are the things that some things we want to temper, but there must be some good stuff here, right? That we get from testosterone and in our men, good aspects of masculinity.
I think so.
What are they?
And it's hard sometimes to separate the good from the bad. So I wrote an article for a magazine in the UK about my husband, Alex, who's British and not very emotionally expressive and extremely stable and kind of I would say has somewhat of a dominant personality in ways, but he doesn't get angry. He always supports me, and you can already see I'm extremely emotional. And I do think that his demeanor has something to do with his testosterone. The Brits are, in fact, less emotionally expressive than everybody else, but true. The men tend to be less emotionally expressive than women. They tend to cry less than women. I'm tearing up constantly, and he hardly ever does. But I wrote about my initially feeling frustrated with what I perceived as his inability to access his emotions, and where is his rich inner emotional life, and why can't he get in touch with it? And I think I bugged him about it, and I made him feel bad about that. And again, through writing the book, I think I just came to appreciate that's just who he is, and he's awesome. And I know that is a big reason I was attracted to him, because I'm so kind of emotional, and I have such highs and such lows, and he's just my rock. So I think that in a sense illustrates both the kind of positive and in some ways negative, because we can't connect in exactly the way I, the woman, the expressive one, want to connect. But we have this thing where if I just appreciate it for what it is, and when I started doing that, things just got a lot better, because I think he felt more accepted and free to be who he is. So there is something about that masculine, for me, that masculine, I think many women respond to it the same way, I think. Masculine kind of stoicism that enables them to be strong in certain kinds of crises where, sorry, I'm going to get nailed for talking this way, because I think this sounds like some sort of anti-feminist view, but it's not. Of course, I'm also very strong in a crisis.
Overlapping distribution.
Different way. Yeah, and I mean, but we have different styles, and they're complementary, but it just so happens that, like, I'm probably more of a physical risk taker than he is. But, that's unusual in that men are more likely to take physical risks to protect others. And that's just a fact. So that's something that I also see as, that's common all over the world, that physical heroism. Yeah. Not when it comes to the children. Women will also, risk their lives for their kids. But when it comes to people they don't know, for instance, that's much more likely to be men. And I do think that has something to do with testosterone. And I have to say, at the end of my class, I always I try to have an open discussion, and I ask, or at the end of, I think, the unit where we talk about testosterone and male behavior, what would the world be like, if we castrated men or something like that, or what would happen if we didn't have testosterone? And a couple years ago, one kid spoke up and he said, I don't think we'd have tall buildings. I don't think we'd have cities. And that's extreme, of course. But then he went on to describe that he thought it's something about that intensely competitive nature, that single-minded focus on goals to build things and create and invent that tends to be more typical of men than women who, yes, are having, doing more parenting and nurturing, right? So he was arguing that a lot of aspects of our civilization are probably due to some of those characteristics. I'm not necessarily, endorsing that because, again, there's tons of overlap, and who knows what the world would be like if there were no testosterone. Yeah. But I just thought that was an interesting way to think about it.
Well, it's also interesting you point to the fact that you get these overlapping distributions, but then at the tails you'll very often see overrepresentation. Yeah. So I didn't even know until I read your book about the Carnegie Hero Medals, for example, that are awarded.
No, I didn't know either until I did the research.
For physical bravery, and they are extraordinary stories. One guy this year actually he died trying to rescue somebody, and it's his second time he got the award. He got it 30 years ago as well. And of the third, so these are people who've shown physical bravery for others, typically strangers. And so far this year, 36 medals have been awarded, and 33 went to men so far. And I think you point out that it just skews massively male. Yeah. Maybe the fact we don't know about that is interesting. And so there is this other side to it, which is maybe a sort of, and again, evolutionary would suggest around risk-taking, etc. But I want to end with what I think is a fear that people have about all of this work generally, and see how you respond to it, which is to say you produce compelling evidence that on average there are these differences between men and women, many of which can be explained by testosterone, but there are overlapping distributions. And so it's impossible to know from the overall distributions what that means for you. And you just said, right, so you're more emotional. I'm quite emotional too, but I'm half Welsh, so I say that's. But you're more physically risk-taking. So, but I'm also quite. So you can think of many different ways in which, as individuals, and what people are afraid of is that people lose that nuance. And so if you come out and say men are more driven by sex,
and they do lose that nuance. That's right.
They're more aggressive, they're braver, they're more driven by sex, and they care a bit more about status. And people will say, aha, well, that's why I shouldn't hire you to be a tenured Harvard professor then. That's why, because you don't care about status as much. Or maybe you don't want, or that's why, it's we'll always have rapists. That's why, whatever. And so, so what you get is statistical discrimination, in other words. So we take the averages and we apply them to individuals in ways that are damaging to those individuals' life prospects. That does seem to be a real danger with this work. How do you handle that?
Yes. You do a better job in science education and statistical literacy. What you don't do is obscure the truth. So these are important issues to understand in our lives, and if we understand how these differences really work, the actual implications are not bad. They do not justify discrimination. There are some questions that I wouldn't want to go, that I actually don't think we should be exploring, that I don't think we should be talking about publicly, because the implications would be very disturbing potentially. There are some things where you just don't even want to go there. Let's just, focus on culture, say. But I think when it comes to sex differences, there's nothing inherently damaging or scary, or there's no monster hiding there. And plus, what people think anyway, the stereotypes that they have are worse than the kind of reality that we can discover through science. People already are going to be forming their own opinions through what they observe, and I would much rather that they are literate in terms of the science and understand how it works. And then we focus on what the implications of that science is. We don't distort the science. We teach people what it means and how to think about it and how to apply it. That's where we have to focus. I just see no argument that distorting the truth or covering up the truth can ever be the right solution to making the world a better place in terms of if we're just talking about kind of addressing things like physical violence.
You want reality-based culture and reality-based policy making. So last question, what's next for you after this adventure? Have you thought ahead to your next project?
I have. The next project is to try to get 8 hours a night of sleep, to just teach my class and run the concentration and pay some attention to my 12-year-old boy and husband and clean up the house. And things are just in disarray because I finished the book during COVID. That was just, a lot of work. And then I went right back to work, but without going to the office, and had to redo all my lectures. And now I'm, talking to you, which is great, but there's a lot to do. And I'm want to get some sleep. That's all I can really think about right now.
That sounds like an eminently sensible plan. And good luck with that. But also, we covered approximately 13% of the ground that I would love to cover you at some point. So maybe one day I'll entice you back on. Perhaps when my own book on boys and men is coming out, I wanted to talk about units.
Can you just say a couple sentences about that?
So I am worried that a byproduct of women's economic independence, which I totally support, count me a full feminist, has been to somewhat cloud what it means to be a successful man. And that, combined with some of the things we've talked around about masculinity, means that we have a growing number of young men and boys in particular who are somewhat adrift, hard to know, a little bit less planful, hard to know what it means to grow into a successful man. What we need, and I'm just going to quote from Joe Henrich here, we do need, I think, a pro-social masculinity for the post-feminist age.
Yes.
And right now you don't get that option. You either think there's a war on women, and you've got to choose sides that reproductive rights, Donald Trump, etc., or you think there's the feminism's gone too far, and we warned you this would happen, and so on. But this has become a very, as you know better than most, a really, really difficult front in the culture wars. But it seems to me that we have to be able to recognize that massive social changes like the success of the women's movement come with consequences.
Can I just ask you a question?
Sure.
About toxic masculinity, because I feel like people are using that term and trying to get males to be more pro-social by talking about toxic masculinity. I don't think it's working. I think it's backfiring.
I think it's a terrible idea. It's a terrible idea. And I actually think it's a good litmus test now. I can't think of anybody whose work I take seriously who likes using that term. There may be people who thought it was okay in its original definitions, but the way it's being used now, I think that anybody that's using it is probably someone whose work you don't need to take seriously, because those have realized that it's not a helpful way to do it. My fear is, and this relates to the work from Pew that I referred to earlier, is that it's done enough damage now that the prefix is no longer needed. If you get to a situation where most people just think masculinity is bad, you don't need the toxic anymore. And so I think this question about what is good about masculinity that's different, overlapping distributions and on average, what's good about it as well as what's challenging about it, we've got to be able to talk about that. And in particular, we've got to be able to have a new cultural script for men, which is compatible with gender equality and doesn't ask them to stop being men. Right now, it's you've got to find a way to have men who are positive in their masculinity and entirely committed to gender equality, and not to
and who don't feel ashamed about being masculine.
No, they feel good about being men. I'm glad I'm a man. It's great being a man. It's also difficult being a man in some ways, but I love being a man, and I want my boys to love being a man, and not to in some way make that a bad thing. But at the same time, that shouldn't in any way mean we aren't 100% committed to equality in every way that matters to women.
Right, or that you can't be a man who has a lot of feminine typical characteristics, and that's 100% fine. You can be a man and express yourself the way that you see fit, right? I mean, it's consistent with that.
Yes, we can have all this variation, but that doesn't mean you have to sandblast away some of these underlying differences. Or situation like somehow or other the idea of femininity kind of survived feminism, and in a way that I think was good. It was like it's okay to want to be feminine, and sometimes for men to do that, right? But it got close at various points, but feminism didn't destroy femininity. Well, we can't destroy masculinity. The idea that the solution here is to destroy the idea of masculinity, partly because of the work people like you have done, I just think that's a fool's errand, and is going to lead us into disaster, and it's going to lead a lot of men either angry or adrift or some
And
combination.
they are. That's happening. That is happening.
Yeah. So but right now, this is a space that's dominated either by, people on the very, very far on the right saying, I told you this would happen. Women need to get there. You let these women loose, then of course you're going to have problems. And the far left, who just say any acceptance of difference or that in some way to worry about boys and men makes you a traitor to the cause of gender equality. But that's where I'm going to try and do my work.
Well, I think it's the exact opposite. I'm really glad to hear that you're working on that. When is that plan?
Well, I'm going to try and
the end
I'm
inside
going
it
to
all,
try
or
and write my book this year, finish it this year,
okay.
and so it'll be published next year, hopefully. So this is by way of an announcement.
Okay. All right, great. Good luck.
Well, thank you for
I'll
for
look
coming
forward
on.
to that.
Enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah.
Great, and thanks again for your work. Thanks for listening to Dialogues. I hope you enjoyed that conversation. And if you did, please take a moment to follow, like, rate, and share the podcast in all the usual places. And send me your thoughts and ideas, including for future guests, to dialoguespod@gmail.com. That's dialoguespod@gmail.com. I'll see you next time.